I hope no one is going to be disturbed. I think last week or 2 weeks ago, we were saying their internet didn't work because of the rain. So let's hope tonight is not going to bother anyone. And we are in chapter 23. And because of everything going on, I'm upstairs, so my whiteboard is downstairs, so can't have that luxury that we had last time, but that's okay. We are in chapter 23. Let's remind ourselves, what's chapter 23 talking about? Well, it's talking about how close you get to God through serving him. And we're like, what? That's a beautiful topic, but what in the world does that have to do with our topic, which is the natural love and feeling it and all such things? Like, what's the connection at all? So we explained that what the Rebbe is going to tell us in 2 chapters, 24 and 25, is how intently far we are from God when we sin, when we transgress his will. So to appreciate that, we want the contrast. We want to understand how enormously close we are every time we fulfill his will. So chapter 23 is about how close, which then puts in perspective the horror, the fear of the separation of sin that we discussed at length in 24 and 25. So again, we're in this long road and we are understanding that we potentially can always access this natural love if we reframe and understand that every moment is potentially like, am I going to serve idols or not? Am I going to get upset? Serve idols. Be fearful? Serve idols. Sulk? Serve idols. Am I going to serve idols or not? Or am I going to say it's all God? It's all God. It's all good. It's all God. We trust him. It's all God. It's amazing. It's all God. It's exactly what it's supposed to be. So with that perspective, we can naturally pull out this love. And when we feel this love, we can cling very close to God and not suffer the separation we're going to discuss in 24 and 25. But for now, in 23, we're discussing how close, which means we don't say one word about this natural love the entire chapter. And last week, we explained that there's 2 different tools we have for getting close to God: the study of Torah and the fulfillment of the commandments, of the mitzvahs. And we said there are different type of closeness because the commandment is expressing God's will. We said every commandment is like a limb to a person. That's why the commandments are literally called the limbs of the king, because they're God's limbs. So every commandment is like his limbs. Just as my fingers are moving now, my hands are moving, and my lips are moving, and my eyes are moving, my eyebrows are moving. I'm not consciously thinking, okay, eyebrows move, okay, fingers move, okay, wrists move. It's just, this is my will, so they do it. Well, that's the relationship of God and the commandments. So when I'm doing a commandment, I'm that close. I'm like his extension, his limbs. But Torah, as we're going to discuss more at length today, is far closer. Because Torah is not a limb of God. Torah and God are as one. Meaning a limb is an extension of. And when I'm doing the commandment, I'm part of that limb. I'm that extension of God. But Torah is God. It's his will. It's his wisdom, which are him. So when I'm immersed in Torah, me, God, will, wisdom, it's all one package deal. It's all one, as we're going to discuss. So there are going to be 3 levels of metaphors the Rebbe gives for us to understand these varying levels of closeness. And the reason why we have 3 metaphors, 3 parables, is because there's 3 different types of closeness we want to express. Last chapter, we did 2 out of the 3. And last week, we did 2 out of the 3. We discussed the commandment itself and my soul and soul powers when I'm doing the commandment. And that has a relationship to God's will, we said, like the body to the soul. A body is nullified to the soul. A body is expressive of the soul. Nullified to, expressive of. Body nullified to soul, expressive of soul. Like the commandment, my soul spiritual energies, my soul garments are nullified to God's will when I do the mitzvah, are expressive of God's will when I do the mitzvah. So my soul and all my spiritual powers, what we call the garments of my soul, and the mitzvah itself, are all as one with God's will as a body is to a soul, which we said, well, you can't really separate a body and a soul. If you did, the body can't live without the soul, and the soul can't live in this world without a body. So they're two very separate things. One's completely physical, one's completely spiritual, but there's a tremendous fusion, melding, merging, synergy between them because one can't exist without the other. And that's how close my soul is and my powers of soul are. And the mitzvah I'm doing is with God's will during the time I'm doing the mitzvah, which we said is twofold. It's during the time I do the mitzvah, and it also actually exists for as long as the mitzvah lasts. Like we said, we light the Shabbos candles. It's my act of the mitzvah, lighting the candles, saying the blessing. And it's as long as those candles are lit, the mitzvah continues. There's that level of nullified to and expressive of God's will between the mitzvah that I've done and God's will, as long as those candles are burning. We said circumcision is as long as a person's alive. A mezuzah is as long as it's still kosher on your doorpost in a kosher fashion. The mitzvah continues, nullified to and expressive of God's will. The last point we were saying was, someone has a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, what happens if you don't have your child have a breast or something? Like,
So
what is he? I mean, he's still Jewish, but like, is he still connected? Like, how does that work, I guess?
it is a very big problem. It's actually one of the things for which one would receive kares, the worst punishment possible, cutting off of the soul, obviously not when the person's a baby. And obviously, if it's a person who's not religious and has no clue, then they would be considered tinok shenishba, like the child captured by the nations, kidnapped, and doesn't know. So he wouldn't be willfully punished because he's unaware. But on a spiritual level, it's a huge, it's huge.
And what if they, let's say, what if the person does give their child a breast, but not a breast, like he's cut by a doctor,
he goes like in the hospital? So that wouldn't be considered a bris. Anybody, that's a good question. Anyone who has a hospital surgery when they're still a baby in the hospital, they would need a moil to do something small, but has to do something to make it literally a bris. And it is considered, so again, we're not talking about fault here because we're saying this is a baby, doesn't know yet anything, or this is an adult, but he's ignorant of his heritage, he doesn't know. So we're not talking about being punished, but the spiritual damage is, that happens to be a very critical commandment, as we can see by the punishment. The fact that we're told that someone who, when he's an adult and willful and chooses not to have a bris, the punishment is the worst punishment given for anything. Kares, it's the worst possible punishment. So therefore, that shows us the enormity of spiritual damage this person is going through. He's not going to get punished. He's ignorant. He knows nothing. So it's not that there'll be a overt punishment to him for choosing not to do this, but it's an enormous spiritual blockage. It's an enormous spiritual damage. And that's why when someone can help someone and bring them to understand and give their child a bris, it's a very great thing to do. So getting back to what we were talking about. So we're saying right now, I don't want to give the example of studying of Torah because that's going to be slightly different. That's what I think what we're doing right now. But right now we're loving God, okay? That's why we're learning. We love God. So there's a mitzvah, love of God. There's my soul invested in the mitzvah. There's the powers of my soul invested in this mitzvah, this commandment. It's a commandment to love God. So the mitzvah, the love of God, my soul, the powers of my soul that are expressing the love of God, all of these are nullified to and expressive of the will of God that wants to be loved, that has a desire that a human should love him. There's also my human heart, the physical part of my body, the organ that's expressing this commandment, this mitzvah, that's loving. That has a different relationship to God's will. Slightly less, because it's literally a piece of physicality, it's a physical organ. So we said the relationship is like a chariot to a rider, where there's less of a oneness than body to soul, because in body to soul, neither can exist without the other. The body's not alive without the soul, and the soul is basically not functional in this world at all without a body. Soul can't serve God. Soul can't be as a soul needs to be without a body. So neither can really exist without the other. The chariot and the driver, one can exist without the other. The chariot can be parked overnight and exists perfectly fine as a chariot or car, taxi, Uber, whatever you want to think of it. And the driver can go home, go out to dinner, have a drink, take a walk. He exists fine without his car. He's just not a driver because he doesn't have the car right now. He's not going anywhere. So it's less of a oneness. It's less of a synergy than body soul. But for a driver to be a driver, he needs a chariot. For a chariot to be functional, it needs a driver. So the two really to function need each other, but they can still exist separately. So that's a less oneness, but still quite one. And that is the degree of oneness that physical part of my body enjoys with God's will for the duration of the commandment. So as long as I'm feeling a love of God in my heart, and that is supposed to be something we feel 24/7, my physical heart is nullified to and expressive of God's will and is one with him as a chariot is to the rider. So the Rebbe says, we are in chapter 23, if you have page 56, the other side of page 28 in the Hebrew, or 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 lines from the top. And this is what our sages said. We say about our forefathers, the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, that they were God's chariot. This is what's said in Bereshis Rabbah. Bereshis Rabbah is the Midrash Haggadah on the book of Genesis, on the book of Bereshis. And it says there that the patriarchs were God's chariot. What does that mean? Shekol Ivrehem, that all of their limbs, kulam, entirely, they were completely separate from matters of this world. And they were only a chariot. Rak l'ratzon ha'elyon levado, only to God's supernal will, kol yameim, all of their days. So the Rebbe here is bringing as a point of reference this off-quoted saying from the Midrash that the patriarchs were God's chariot. Now, what does it do with anything? Because we're saying that we can be God's chariot and that we are God's chariot. My body is God's chariot right now, because right now I am teaching God's Torah. So my tongue, my lips, my larynx, my palate, my eyes, my hands, my brain, all of those parts of my body are right now God's chariot, because every one of the body parts I just enumerated are part of what I'm doing right now in teaching God's Torah. And all of your body parts that you're using right now to learn God's Torah are equally God's chariot. So once we're talking about God's chariot, we can understand this very famous quotation from the Midrash, from Bereshis Rabbah, about the patriarchs. Because the Midrash says the patriarchs were God's chariot. Now, hey, me too. No, we're saying slightly different. By me, it's specifically the part of body engaged in the commandment, and specifically for the duration of the commandment. So right now, my eyes that are focused on these black screens and the words in the book, in the Tanya, and the few people, thank you, like Rachel, that I see. My eyes are God's chariot. My lips, my tongue, my larynx, my palate, my teeth, all those parts are enabling me to speak. It's all God's chariot. My hands that I use for punctuation marks, it's all God's chariot. But the rest of me at this moment is not. My torso is not per se God's chariot. Well, what do you mean? How could you have an arm and eyes and a mouth without a torso? Obviously, you need a functioning body to live. But to be God's chariot, that's a very intense expression that literally, as a chariot is to the rider, my body is to God's will. It's specifically those parts of the body that right now God's light is shining on them. Like imagine the chariot, the car is going where the driver directs it. My body parts are expressive of God's will and going exactly to embody his will. So as those lights are flashing in very specific localized parts of my body and in your body that are engaged in this commandment. But by our forefathers, it was their entire body. Every single cell, every part of their body. And it was constantly. It wasn't when they're doing this commandment. You could say, well, they're probably always doing some commandment. Their whole existence is a commandment, meaning they were so nullified to God's will. There was no part of them that was off, and there was no time that was off. Like here, okay, the class is gonna be over, and then each one of us can go back to our dirty dishes or whatever else is calling your name now. So you turned off the switch, like you were being holy and you were being godly and doing God's will, and now perhaps you're gonna do something mundane, and we're human and we need to do both. So there went that light. There went my body being God's chariot. Unless I'm still loving God in my heart or doing something like that. And then that part of my body is still God's chariot. But by the patriarchs, there was no off time. Doesn't make difference. They were washing their dishes, feeding their animals, sweeping their huts, their tents. Whatever they were doing, that was God's will. Everything about them was expressive of God's will. There was nothing that wasn't God's will. Their entire life with every body part, every moment was God's will. And we can somewhat emulate that during the time we're doing the commandment. Because then that body part engaged in the commandment for that duration of time also enjoys being one with God, God's will, like the chariot. Any questions on any of this?
What about Sarah's Grahomea?
Interesting. We don't know. I was wondering that also. One of us picked up each other's brainwaves. It says the avos, the forefathers, patriarchs. So I don't know if we want to assume, and of course the matriarchs who were even holier, or we want to say this was something exclusive of the patriarchs. I don't know. Anyone else? Any other questions? Okay, continuing. But now we want to speak about an even higher relationship. What could be higher? At this moment, all these body parts are shining and nullified to God's will, like so close, like a chariot to a rider. And my soul is like body to soul. Could there be higher? Yeah. And there is when we learn Torah, which is what we're doing right now. But the thoughts of Torah in the brain, and the power of speech of the words of Torah with one's mouth, which is the inner garments of the godly soul, because the godly soul has three garments. Garments meaning powers of expression, a power of action, a power of speech, and a power of thought. So when I study and learn God's word, Torah, I'm engaging my soul, and I'm engaging her more inner intimate garments, her more inner intimate powers, her power of thought as I think Torah, and her power of speech as I right now am talking Torah. Now you are all thinking Torah. If you don't ask questions, you might not be talking Torah, but you're all thinking Torah. So your soul is engaged, and your soul's expression, power, garment of thought is engaged in the most intimate thing possible with God in Torah. And even more than the oneness, my garments of soul, my powers of soul will enjoy. How much more so my soul herself? The power, our powers within that is the soul itself, and that's far more bound up with God at this moment. All of them are absolutely fused with complete oneness, B'ratzon ha'elyon, in God's will, below Merkava Levad, not just on the level of this chariot. Ki ratzon ha'elyon, because the will of God, hu hadvar halacha atzma. This is the content we're learning and studying. This is the Torah itself, the halacha itself, the law itself. Shemahar madar ba, that you're thinking about, that you're speaking about. Shekol halachos, that all halachos, all laws, all godly laws, all godly parts of Torah, are details, specific aspects of God's will. That thus rose up in the will of God. This is permissible, or kosher, or it's kosher, it's fit, or pater, or exempt, or zakai, or meritorious. Those are all the positives. Or it could be the opposite. It could be forbidden and treif and taboo and all such things. And not just the halachos. All the formation of letters of all the scriptures, all of Torah, all of the prophets, all of the writings. That's God's will and wisdom. That's absolutely one with the infinity of God. As Maimonides says, God is that the knower, God is that which is known. So what we're saying here is there's a oneness enjoyed by my body parts when I serve God. And that oneness is on the level of chariot to rider. There's a deeper oneness enjoyed by my soul and her garments, her powers of expression, when I do a commandment. And that's the oneness of body to soul. And now there's a far deeper oneness, so deep that the Rebbe just called it absolute one. Yichud Gamor. The Yichud Gamor, like the aspects of soul to the soul herself, where you can't separate. With the chariot to the rider, we could say, okay, you park your car, you go into the store, the car exists, and you and the store exist. Now, you can't do that between you, body, and soul, but the body is physical and the soul is spiritual, and I could definitely discriminate between the two, but we cannot separate them. And then there's the soul and her powers, the soul and her bechinos, her aspects, where you can't say this is where the soul stops and the aspects begin. This is soul and this is her power. Like you can't, body and soul, you understand the discrimination of a physical body and a spiritual soul, but you can't separate the two, that's for sure. But the soul and her aspects, there's not even that clear line, that cutoff, the demarcation of this is a boundary of soul and this is powers of soul. Like it's just one, right? The Rebbe says. That's what's happening to your soul and to your intimate soul powers of thought and even of speech when you study Torah, which is unbelievable. If we understand what Torah is, the Rebbe says, understand what Torah is. Torah is God's, the creator, the infinite one, what he wants and what he thinks, his will and his wisdom. And he took this infinite will and this infinite wisdom and he encapsulated it in little ideas digestible to a little human brain. So I'm human, which means my brain is very finite, as it is. And in my little finite brain, I can understand Torah. God made himself that small. There's the laws. We're just discussing circumcision. So it's a Jew and it's a boy and it's 8 days old and it's in this part of the body and with this person who's done this training, who's cutting like this and doing all very specific, concrete details that any human mind can absorb, within which is encapsulated the infinity of God's will and wisdom. And the same thing is true right now. We're studying Tanya. We're studying Torah. We're studying ideas, deep ideas, but ideas that we understand. Hopefully we're understanding what we're studying. If you don't understand, it doesn't count. But as we're understanding whatever we're understanding, again, God took the infinity of his will, the vast infinity of his wisdom, and he crunched it so small that it gets into my human brain. And as it is digested by my human brain, of course, is a chariot to God, God being the rider, God's will being the rider, my brain being the chariot. But my soul and my soul's power of thought, and if I'm speaking, my soul's power of speech are much, much deeper. They're absolutely one. Because this infinity of God, of his will and of his wisdom, and the soul and these garments, again, you can't say this is where this one stops and this one starts. It's so absolutely interwoven one, containing and contained by. It's much, much deeper than a mitzvah. Because as we learn, we digest. Meaning when I do the commandment, I am doing whatever it is for God. But when I learn, I'm digesting. I'm taking into my brain his thoughts. So it's a very different process, and therefore it has a very different impact, which is the same reason why we say that Torah is the only food for the soul. You can and hopefully do serve God all day long. We do mitzvahs, we do commandments all day long, but none of that feeds our soul. The only thing that actually feeds our soul is what's digested by our soul. And mitzvahs aren't digested by my soul. I'm doing them. What I'm taking in and digesting inwardly is Torah. So that's why it's so amazing. So the Rebbe says, first of all, understand how absolutely one is a relationship, and understand what are you in relationship with. Your relationship with Torah, which is God's will and wisdom, which is him. God is one with his will. God is one with his wisdom. Torah is his will and wisdom. The Jew studying Torah is one with God's will and wisdom, one with Torah, which means one with God's will and wisdom, which means one with God. As we have the quote from Maimonides, that's been brought already several times in Tanya. When Maimonides is discussing God, he says, Hu amada, hu yodeh, hu yodua. He is that which is known. He is the knower. He is the ability to know. Meaning all aspects of God on its highest level is absolutely one. This is the same him. He is Torah. He is the ability to conceptualize Torah. He is the one who knows Torah. It's all one. It's all him. And when I learn Torah, it becomes all one. It becomes all me. Any questions, any thoughts on any of this? Okay, so now we're going to speak a bit of this enormity of Torah to appreciate what this means, that I'm one with Torah and therefore absolutely one with God when I study. And this is what's written. The Araisa v'kuchabrichu kulo chad. Remember, we quoted this in the beginning of the chapter from the Zohar. In the beginning of the chapter, we said the commandments are God's limbs, but Torah and God are absolutely one, which we discussed last week. So the Rebbe says, now I can understand this. It's like the commandment versus Torah could be the difference between a metaphor for that is, this isn't exactly a metaphor, this is literally what it says. It says Torah is the blueprints of creation. Torah is God's blueprints. Blueprints are not a modern invention. Torah is God's blueprints. In the Torah, it discusses commandments. So when I do the commandment, I'm giving body, giving substance to the blueprints. So imagine there's this architect and he has these massive, amazing, beautiful blueprints for your building. And then someone builds the building. Even though, of course, at the end of the day, you need the building built. You can't live in a blueprint. It's not very functional or beneficial for you, a piece of paper. You need the building. But the blueprint is far closer to you or the architect and the vision of this building than the actual building itself. That's like one step removed. That's like taking the paper and bringing it to life. But there's always going to be something lost in the translation. So that's like me or God, if you will, Torah and the mitzvahs. God's will and wisdom is invested in his blueprints in Torah. When the mitzvah is done, so that blueprint now has flesh, now becomes actualized. So that's good. Again, piece of paper is only a piece of paper. You need the building. But it's a step removed. The blueprint is far closer to the will and wisdom than the mitzvah, which is flowing from that blueprint, Torah. So when the Jew is learning Torah, he's one with God on the level of his conception, on the level of his vision, his will and his wisdom. When the Jew, that same Jew, does the mitzvah that Torah ordains, that's great, that's amazing, that's why we're in this world. But it's not as close. It's taking your will and now embodying it. But when you're on the level of Torah, you're in the space of the will itself. And that's why the Zohar says, Torah and God are absolutely one. Commandments are God's limbs. A limb expresses your will. Commandments express God's will. But Torah is the limb, which is why we're so much closer to God when we study than in any other way possible. So that's why it states in the Zohar that Torah and God are absolutely one and not limbs of the king, which is quite high, but not as high as being absolutely one. That's the relationship the commandments have. So since the will of God that is absolutely fused with the infinity of God is completely one at this moment in a revealed way, there's no concealments. At this moment for your soul, if you are paying attention, focused, learning at this moment, as we are currently learning this page, this word, this chapter, this concept in Tanya, God's will is absolutely revealed and one with your soul. No barriers, no separation. We said complete oneness, that we can't say this is where this one stops and this one starts. So fused. Well, I don't feel a thing. Well, that's good. That's how you're surviving. If you felt it, you wouldn't survive the process. But that's what's happening at this moment when we study. In your godly soul. And not only the soul, even her garments, which are lower than her, the expressions of soul, the thought of the soul, the speech of the soul. This is no holds barred, no barriers, nothing between them. God's will, my soul's power of speech, my soul's power of thought, all absolutely one as long as I keep studying. For the duration of time that the person is engaged in studying words of Torah. And again, we say here studying, we're not here talking about reading words of Torah. Obviously, sometimes we don't understand what we're studying, so we just read it. Or we're officially understanding, but our mind's like a few million miles away. So we're also still really just reading. Then this doesn't happen. This happens when you're understanding, because again, understanding is a digesting process that enables God in Torah to be so absolutely one with the soul containing that Torah. So the Rebbe says, wait a minute. If I'm saying you're absolutely one with God's will during the time you're studying his Torah, you means your godly soul and her two inner garments of thought and speech. Guess what? You're also absolutely one with the infinity of God himself. Meaning, Torah is God's will and wisdom, which I have my board, right? The Jew studying Torah, God's will and wisdom, all one. So therefore the Jew studying the Torah, God's will and wisdom, which emanate from the supernal will of God, absolutely one. There's wait, it's one more step. The Jew studying the Torah, God's will and wisdom, supernal will of God, the infinity of God, because that's what's expressed in that supernal will, all absolutely one. The Rebbe says, look what's going on. Jew to Torah, to God's will and wisdom, to the supernal will of God, to the infinity of God, one. So you right now, one with the infinity of God, with the Creator. in his absolute infinite space. And me, finite me, through the bridge that's pulling us together and making us one, called Torah. Versus this is unbelievable, because nothing in any of the supernal worlds has any ability to be one with the infinity of God. Like, take the highest level of creation you can think of. I don't know, an angel, a big angel, the angel Michael, the angel Gabriel, the angel Raphael. You know a little more. You talk about spiritual worlds, Atzilus. You want to get higher than Atzilus, the worlds of Taihu, the Kudim, Akudim, Verudim. All of that cannot be one with the infinity of God. Impossible. How could they be? They're creations. He's creator. But a Jew learning Torah is. That's what's happening right now. Even though we don't feel a thing, it's happening. Again, if we felt it, it couldn't happen. We would cease to exist. We'll be blown away by the energy. By Mashiach, it'll happen and we'll feel it. For now, it happens and we don't feel a thing. But it's happening. Any questions on any of this? Any thoughts, any comments, any questions?
Aren't we always connected strongly to Hashem?
For sure we are. You could be doing nothing. Forget about you. Everything in all of creation is only godliness. Classical example, my cell phone, conveniently here. This is a piece of inanimate, whatever makes it a cell phone, definitely inanimate. Is it godly energy? Of course it's godly energy. The only building block of this world is godly energy. But is this, at this moment, one with the infinity of God? Not at all. It's a cell phone. No. Is the Malach Michal, is the angel Michal one with the infinity of God? Not at all. Not be able to survive the process. No holds on the infinity of God. So there's godliness, there's God's energy, and there's God. And within God, there are levels. And here we're saying we, through learning Torah and the infinity of the Creator, are absolutely one. And there's no other way to achieve that.
But aren't we even, I mean, I would say like a Jew is higher level than the chair or phone.
Absolutely.
I'm saying like we're more connected than that.
So the Jew, true, I was bringing the phone as the example of everything is godliness. But the Jew, in his dormant state, meaning you're just like sitting there spacing out. So your body is potentially receiving its energy from God, depending on, hopefully, if you've been doing good things. And your soul is a piece of God. Your soul is the closest thing to God there is. The soul of the Jew and God is the closest thing. But it's not, I'm trying to think of a parable to explain it. It's like, maybe think of it, I don't know if this is the greatest parable, but this is what came to my brain right now. Let's think of a battery, right? You have a battery and it's just, lying in your drawer with all your batteries. It's a good battery. It's versus all the bad batteries that are probably lying in the drawer too. It's a good, fresh, new battery. So it's full of tremendous energy, but it's not doing anything because it's just lying in the drawer. If you take that battery and you put it in where batteries go, and suddenly something's happening, so the energy is coursing through the battery because of the connections on both sides and how it all works. So I don't know if that's the best metaphor for it. I'm just trying to think of something to explain what I'm saying because it's a good question. I'm trying to answer it. Your soul contains inside of herself everything. The essence of our soul is one with the essence of God. But it's like that battery in the shelf, so to speak. There's tremendous energy, enormous power, but as yet unexpressed, untapped. When the soul connects to Torah, suddenly, now we have the connectors. And now something's happening. Something enormous is happening that didn't happen when the soul is sitting there without any of this godly connectors. Now, there's a godly connector of a commandment. There's a godly connector of Torah. They're both amazing. I'm not trying in this chapter to dissuade anyone from doing commandments. But in terms of intimacy of bond, nothing can compare with Torah. Perhaps in terms of impact on world, commandments are more beneficial. You know, the classical example of a commandment, so we might say the ultimate example of a commandment, is a commandment of charity. The commandment of charity tremendously impacts and changes the world, and actually tremendously changes and impacts your animal soul, which is a big reason why you're in this world. So in terms of my productivity, you know, America is a very productive oriented society. So in terms of my productivity is much greater when I'm giving charity than when I'm studying. When I'm giving charity, I'm changing many, many, many things in the world, which is why I'm in this world. So my productivity is very high. But when I learn God's will, I become one with it. So in terms of the intimacy of the bond, I don't get that when I give charity. But I need to give charity and be productive and change the world. Absolutely. So you need to do both. But if we sort of weigh it, we can understand, again, the goal of this chapter, as I told you, was how close we get to God. So if my focus is how close, nothing compares with Torah. How productive, maybe I should be giving charity. But if I study Torah and I'm really close, I'll be really inspired to give lots of charity. So that's why it's good to study. Again, like we're envisioning my metaphor of the battery now connected by the two little ends being correctly, you put it in the right way, the plus and the minus and everything. So now all the energy is coursing through. So the intensity of energy when I study Torah is not matched by when I give charity. But if I have all that energy, I'm now inspired to go and change the world and give lots of charity and do all the other commandments and help lots of people become close to God. But let me take the battery out of the socket, you know, let me put it back in the drawer. Well, the battery still has tremendous energy. But because it's not in the right place, it's not making the connection. So every godly soul is enormous, but the godly soul has to make a connection for its energy to be expressed. That could be, if you will, an understanding of why the Lubavitcher Rebbe innovated a very unique concept that some have copied since, but not so many, because it might seem an unusual expenditure of resources. And that's the idea of this on the street, get a Jew to do a mitzvah, which we call mivtzayim. A mitzvah means a campaign. So on the street, get a Jew to put on tefillin. On the street, get a Jewish woman to commit to lighting the candles of the Shabbos. That's a heavy expenditure of resources, of manpower, of time, of money. Well, where's your gain? I mean, are you making them religious? Are they going to come support your institutions? Are they going to study in your schools? You'll never see them again. Like, what did you put all that energy for? But if you understand, as Frum was saying, the power of the soul, and you understand, as I'm explaining it, the power of the mitzvah to put the battery in its case, make the connection between this enormous power of the soul and that mitzvah that's going to ignite it. Now you understand why we put so much energy into getting a Jew, even once, to do a mitzvah, to do a commandment. But if you take away the commandment, that Jew's soul is completely intact, but not necessarily is it as capable of impacting him. But when we get that soul to do a commandment, when we get that soul to study Torah, now the soul's energy is expressed. And now you can impact the person and make complete changes in the person and in the world. Any other thoughts, any questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
This might sound silly, but when I give tzedakah, let's say in the pushka, my daughters always love to give, little kids are so excited. So sometimes I just let them do it instead of me. Is it still a mitzvah that I'm getting or not really? Is it more my kids, even though they already, I give them separately and they still want to give more?
It depends how you view it. If you want to technically view your daughters as your emissaries, your shluchim, so you could say, I'm giving the charity and my children are my emissaries, so it's my mitzvah. Or you might say, listen, I'm the mother and I provide my children with all their needs, including money for charity. So I'm giving them this coin. It's now their money, so it's their mitzvah. So it depends how you're viewing it. Is it my money and they're my emissaries and putting it in for me? It's my mitzvah. I'm
I mean,
giving
like,
them the nickel. Now it's their mitzvah.
I mean, like, I'll give them their separate, and then they still
I hear
want to
what you're
take my,
saying.
you know what I mean?
I
Like,
hear
they
what you're
just don't
saying.
hate
It depends on how you look at it. It literally depends how you're viewing it would really impact how it is.
That's interesting.
Because an emissary is considered like an extension of the person. So if you would give someone $1 and say, go over to that person collecting money and give it charity, is it your mitzvah or is it their person's mitzvah? It's your mitzvah. You're just sending the person as your emissary. They're your shliach. They're your emissary. That's the concept of a shliach is a legal halachic concept. Shlucho shel adam kimoso, that a shliach is like the person himself, is a legal concept. So legally, if you appoint someone to do the mitzvah for you, it's like an extension of you doing it. Any other questions? Any other thoughts on any of this? Okay, so yeah, like another minute. Let's just see a little bit more. I have to find my place, of course. So when the person is learning Torah, they're absolutely one with the infinity of God, during the time of the study of Torah. As we explained, so bound up that we can't separate between the two. Like the oneness of God, of God's speech, of God's thoughts with God. So the Rebbe is saying, I'm saying you're so one. You know how one you are? You are as one with the infinity of God. When you study his will and wisdom, when you study Torah, as God's speech and thoughts are one with God, because there's no barriers between. Again, there's a Jew, there's Torah, there's God's will and wisdom. Now we're adding, there's God's speech and thoughts, and there's God's infinity. And it's all one. There's no barriers here between God's will and wisdom and God's speech and thought expressing that will and wisdom, and God's Torah, which is God's will and wisdom, and God's infinity, which is expressed in his will and wisdom, in his speech and thought, in his Torah, and you, because you're one with all of this right now. So the Rebbe says, is there a barrier between God's thoughts and God? Between God's speech and God? No. And there's no barriers between you and God either, because you're absolutely one with that whole package deal of Torah, which is his will and wisdom, which is his thoughts and speech, which is him. That's what's happening right now as you study the Torah. Ki ein shum davar nifra, because there's no separations. There's no barriers. There's nothing outside of this union. Ki ein behester panim kanal, only there's a concept of the seeming concealments. And you could think, well, that's pretty cool. But I mean, I'm sure God is closer to planet Atzilus. That's the highest level of world I know. That's really holy. Sorry, that must be closer to God. No, it's absolutely not. Planet Atzilus is not one with God's infinity and God's will and wisdom and God's thoughts and speech. Planet Atzilus wouldn't be able to handle it. In other words, we have all this oneness and don't feel a thing because of the barriers, because we're within a body, because we're so limited. That's a tremendous advantage here. Because we don't feel a thing, we can have all of this taking place. If we felt it, we would like die from the first experience. And we've been learning Torah for many years. We would never be able to learn Torah. We would literally die from the experience, from the intensity of being one with the infinity of God himself. So planet Atzilus or an angel or any spiritual dimension feels, sees, experiences, and therefore can never have this because they would cease to exist. But we don't feel a thing, so we can have it and exist and absorb all of this energy, which means we have so much power. You know, it's amazing sometimes how strong we are. And the Rebbe is saying we get a lot of power when we study Torah. Because when we study Torah, we're one with God on such a deep level, like no spiritual world is one with him. So what happens to me as a result of that? What happens to my soul as a result of that? It's so charged There's so much power in me. And I can go and change worlds, change my world, change other people's worlds, because I'm so charged with the energy of God's infinity. And just think, this doesn't cost any money. This is available to all of us. In previous times I can't say it, but now I can say it. Go on your phone, go on your computer. Books are not so expensive. Classes, everyone's offering classes. Most people offer classes for free. It's available. It's so available in all languages, all different mediums. And look what's happening. It's like we become one with the infinity of God. And maybe because it's so cheap, it's so accessible, we don't appreciate what's happening. We don't get it. But it's like, just keep investing in it. Like the story with the Roman convert, the prince Onkelos, was a great sage, and he's in almost every printed Chumash. But when he was still a Roman prince wanting to become a Jew, when he was looking for an excuse to leave the palace and go become a Jew, he told his uncle, the Caesar, he was wants to, make his way in the world, dabble in this thing called business. Obviously, he's a prince, he has loads of money, but for fun, so to speak. Experiment, experience. And he said, oh, that's a good thing. So he asked his uncle, any business advice? His uncle said, yeah. Go out and buy something that right now isn't appreciated. A commodity that you see as valuable, but isn't appreciated. So you can get it cheap. And then whenever it appreciates its value, you'll cash it in and you make a lot of money. So he listened to his advice and he became a Jew. Obviously, there's many, many details on the story of Onkelos, but fast forwarding to years later, he goes back to his uncle, who's furious that his nephew became a Jew. He says, what did you do? He said, I listened to your advice. What did I find in this world more valuable than being a servant of God? And so unappreciated, so cheap, so accessible, so easy, so there for me. There'll be a time when the world will appreciate it, so to speak, then we cash in. But for now, it's for the taking. So valuable and so unappreciated. And that's really all of serving God. And especially here, we're saying for Torah study, it's hard for us to really get how valuable it is. And even after spending an hour talking about it, it's still hard to really apply it, because if you really apply it, you've run to learn something now. Or at least make sure you do so tomorrow morning. It's so valuable, but it's cheap. It's not appreciated. So it seems like, I can learn today, I can learn tomorrow, I can learn the next day, I can find some time eventually, whatever. So unappreciated of its worth, but it's so yours for the taking. So it's time now to just grab it in and grab it in and grab it in. Until that time, of course, when everyone will appreciate its worth. All right. Anybody has something they'd like to share? The kindness of God or miracle of their week? Anyone? So many kindnesses happen all the time. Anyone have something they'd like to share, to thank God for?
I could say something. It's not really this week, it's like the ending of last week, but I was really worried about sending my daughter to school this year, for parnasa reasons, like finding my new job situations. But I had two huge miracles happen right before Shabbos that my child's tuition is pretty much paid for this whole year.
Wow.
It was amazing. And I'm so grateful. So thank you, Hashem.
Beautiful.
It's amazing.
Thank you, Hashem. That's amazing. So there's plenty of parents worried about how they're paying tuition at this moment. So thank you, Hashem, that's not on your worry list now. Beautiful. Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. Anyone else have something to share? Something they would like to thank Hashem for? Thank God for?
Well, I just want to thank Hashem for giving me the koach to deal with all that is going on and still keep, positive. I mean, it's all positive, really, just very hard work. Things are moving very slow. I'm dying to be already in my house. And, it just, and with work and everything. But Hashem really gives me koach. And I'm very thankful for that. Baruch Hashem. Not complaining.
Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem. We always have to look at it and see it in the positive. It's easy for us to slip into the negative, and then we have to say, no, I don't worship idols. It's all God. It's all good. It's all exactly what he wants. Every slow worker, every dysfunctional worker, it's all exactly what God wants. It's all part of his plan.
It's all temporary. It's going to be Bezrat Hashem.
Right. Anyone else? I think all of our lives are full of God's kindnesses, and sometimes like they're personal, so you don't want to share them or don't feel comfortable sharing them. But might not seem as spectacular as someone paying your year's worth of tuition, but it's good for us to acknowledge them ourselves, and when we can share them, because sharing them is what God wants us to do. That's why we do this. The Lubavitcher Rebbe says it's a tool to bring the redemption, is to acknowledge and share the miracles that we're all experiencing. So, looking at the thought of this week, all right. So this is from the Rebbe's talk of 1991, last time we had the Rebbe's talking to us on this week's Torah portion. And the Rebbe says that everything that the Rebbe is saying has a special relationship to the redemption that has to come immediately. If you look at all the signs in the world in 1991 already, there's all clear signs of the redemption. The Rebbe says this is the most significant, important, timely issue. Because based on all of the signs that we're experiencing, the redemption should have been here a long time ago. So it's understood that now, as we talk to God, as is quoted in this week's Torah portion, in terms of the commandment of the first fruits of the Bikurim, especially now in this month of Elul. Because of course, as we know, in Elul, it's like God is with us in the field. So whoever wants to talk to the king can just start talking. He's right here with us. So God's listening to us very intently in this month. This is a month of compassion. Hopefully all of us experienced some pieces of compassion. Doesn't mean it was an easy month. Might have been hard stuff as well. But you still experience God's compassion this month. So now when God's in the field with us, the king's in the field, now when we feel God's compassion, now when God is so tuned into us, we can say a special request from God with a very loud voice. Until when? Ad Masai, to bring the redemption now. Redemption should have happened a long time ago. And everything good we're experiencing is a sign of it. And everything that doesn't seem good we're experiencing is a sign of it. And God, it should have happened. It needs to happen. You want it to happen. Just bring the redemption now. That's our message to God. That's the message the Rebbe said in 1991, and it's completely current now in 2021. God, we know you want it even more than we do. Just please bring the redemption now. But thank you so much for joining. Appreciate everyone that came on, and we should have a wonderful week. And when you have an opportunity, take advantage and try to learn a little more Torah. And remember,
Thank you so much.
Power.
Thank you. B'sorot tovot. Thank you so much.
Thank you. B'sorot tovot. Thank you.